Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Mr. Robot Season 3, Episode 6, Kill Process. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Mr. Robot, so I have to start with a spoiler warning for Mr. Robot up to Season 3, Episode 6. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise things will be spoiled for you. So I watched this episode 3 times now, 3 and some change, because I watched some scenes 4 times. So I can say pretty confidently now, like having think this over and really looked at the episode, that this is my favorite episode of Mr. Robot of the entire show so far. I was completely and utterly blown away by this episode. I think this episode is a masterpiece. It's just amazingly constructed, executed. Everything about it just really, really works. So it's quite interesting because I talked about in my review for the previous episode how that was kind of part 1 of a 2-parter, and this is definitely part 2 of that 2-parter, but it's really interesting how this is pretty much like the inverse, or like the opposite of the previous episode, because the previous episode was sort of a new sort of breakthrough because it was one continuous shot that followed it. I mean, you know, it wasn't really one continuous shot, but it was made to look like one continuous shot, like we followed the action like nonstop and real time, which was a really big change for Mr. Robot they hadn't done before. This episode was kind of the opposite, because this episode was actually sort of intercut, fast-paced, bunch of different storylines interwoven together in a sort of fast-paced edit that the show typically has never done before. Usually they focus on storyline in blocks, for the most part. Definitely never like this fast, because it pretty much focuses on all of the major characters. We got Elliot, we got Dom, we got Tyrell, we got Darlene, we got Angela, and they're all like, all their scenes are intercutting like very fast, sort of at the same time, and building on the same story. I think the comparison I would make is one of my favorite movies, which I know a lot of people don't like, but I like it specifically because of the editing, and that's Cloud Atlas, where it does the same thing, where it has multiple storylines going at the same time. They're all sort of interwoven, and I guess Sense8 is another example of that, because Sense8 takes a lot from Cloud Atlas, but Sense8 didn't do it very well, so maybe not a good example. But at times it did, but at times it fumbled. But this is a perfect example of doing that, of having multiple storylines and just each scene sort of building off the other, and like the tension building scenes, like we cut from Elliot trying to get to the cold room to stop it, and then we cut to Dom trying to find Tyrell, and then we cut to Tyrell burning the letter, and we cut to Angela on the subway with the gun pointed at her head, and it's just each thing builds after another. So in that way, it's kind of the opposite of last episode, because last episode was one continuous long motion shot with no interruptions, where this one was fast paced, cut. So it's pretty much the opposite, and I love that. That's such an innovative way to do a 2-parter, where you have the first 2 parts done in almost complete opposite sort of manner, but they come together to tell one complete story. Absolutely brilliant. This episode in on itself was just amazingly brilliant. It was the most high stakes, high tension, like there was never a dull moment in this episode at all, and just the whole thing, I don't know, it's just beautiful. So let me get into it, and let me start with the opening flashback scene. We get Angela as a child. Now, I've watched this scene several times, and I think I teared up or outright bawled like a baby every time I watch this scene. This scene is just so amazingly done. This is such a powerful scene, probably one of the best I've seen ever. Now, typically when Mr. Robot and other shows do flashbacks like this, especially to when they're children, I think, this is kind of boring, kind of waste of time. I can't describe how poignant this scene wasn't like the music and it's everything built. So the whole thing was about, they knew, Angela's mother knew she was going to die, so she threw like a farewell party, which is an interesting concept. So Angela, as a little girl, of course, was not on board with this. She wasn't having it, and wasn't comfortable with it. And you see Elliot's father, who's of course played by Christian Slater. And it's interesting seeing Christian Slater play Elliot's father rather than Mr. Robot, because they are two complete people. Mr. Robot's a bit woohoo crazy, whereas Elliot's father comes off of more as the typical father type. And it was so interesting seeing him play this other character and having him sort of interact with little girl Angela and trying to be like. Now, I think maybe the foreshadowing about, if Elliot gets in trouble, you have to give him a push too, that was somewhat forced. But it's okay. I'm willing to forgive it because of everything else in this scene that just works so wonderfully well. Now, first, before I get into the scene proper, I have to mention, maybe it's a bit obvious, and maybe some people think it's too obvious to be the case, but they cut to the Back to the Future cartoon. Now, I don't know if anyone remembers this. Is aired in the early 90s. I remember watching it when I was a kid. It wasn't on for very long. I think just 1 or 2 seasons before it got canceled. But it's interesting, they're playing the Back to the Future music, and when Elliot's dad is even talking to her, he makes up a Back to the Future metaphor. So come on. Time travel, Back to the Future. I think this is very heavily foreshadowing about the time travel elements, which are becoming harder and harder to ignore. But anyway, moving past that, we see Elliot's mother and father talking to the lawyer, and it's interesting. It's the same lawyer that Angela went to, and she mentions a benefactor who wants to support her, give her money, and give her new treatments and stuff, but she refuses, and her husband's not very happy to hear about this benefactor. Who is this benefactor? My first thought is White Rose, because we know earlier White Rose has mentioned the Washington Township plant, like she had some involvement way back. I think she even said she knew Elliot's father. I don't know if I remember that correctly, but I don't know. I strongly feel that she had her hands in this whole thing. I think we're going to find out that Angela's mother and Elliot's father were involved in this thing, whatever White Rose is doing from the very beginning. And this is just an extension of that. I don't know. Just a thought. But anyway, so the whole scene is when Angela's little girl goes up to her mother, and her mother just, she can tell she's not comfortable because she's going to, having this I'm going to die party, like the cake even said, see you in the next life. It's an interesting concept. I can see why, Angela wouldn't be okay with this. And I love how she Angela's mother just gave her this talk. It's like, we will see each other again. I'm trying to get through this without tearing up, because this was such a powerful scene, where a mother, who knows she's gonna die, telling her child this, it was just amazing. And of course, it sets up Angela's character absolutely beautiful. This is why this flashback is amazing. Just not because in its own right, but it adds so much to the story. And actually, it really gets you invested in why Angela is so hardcore on wanting to. Apparently, some way she thinks that doing this will bring her mother back. And this totally, because before when they mention Angela's mother, you just think of, what a motherly love like, but it was more of generic, where this personalizes this you actually see her, and you see this thick connection that they have, and that she said that I'll always be with you, and we will see each other again. And so that really makes her storyline going forward makes so much more sense. I cannot say enough good things about this scene, so I think it's time to move on. So then the scene ends. It cuts to right where the last episode left off, with Angela and Elliot's confronting Angela, and this interaction again was like pure gold. Amazing how at first Angela's just trying to, she even mentions, oh, nobody's going to die. In fact, our parents are going to be okay. And Elliot's natural reaction, of course, is, what the hell are you talking about? And I love the altercation between them. And when Elliot starts getting, like, violent and just yelling at her, she, shuts down, gets into like full professional mode, and like, oh, Mr. Olderston, I don't believe you're supposed to be here. I understand that you were fired. That was so cold. That was just so perfect. And I think that's when Elliot knew that that he she wasn't going to be any help, and he needed to look elsewhere. So a couple interesting thoughts about this scene is, apparently there was a theory, and this was confirmed by one of the writers to be true. I didn't think much of it, but in the scene, one of the scenes of the last episode where Angela is wearing the F Society mask and trying to get off that level, you see someone with a backpack running in the background, and apparently everyone's like, oh, that's Elliot, because it's not an F Society person. I think, you guys are reading too much into that something, but Reddit confirmed that was in fact Elliot, and they did that on purpose, and it was showing, and he even says in this scene, I saw you go to the thing, what did you do, what did you give, and she said she already gave the thing to someone else, and when he asked who it was, she wouldn't tell him. I wish she would have just said sandwich guy. That's what I love referring to him as, sandwich guy. Now, I have a feeling, knowing I'm going to skip ahead to what we know, what happens at the end of the episode. So, I mean, obviously you should have seen it by the time watching this video, but knowing what we know, and it seems very clear that Angela doesn't know, because she thinks both she and Ella think it's just going to be the one building that blows up. But I do get the impression that the stuff, like whatever she did to override Elliot's safeguards and what she did to push things forward, wasn't just for that building. It was for all the buildings they destroyed, and without that vital piece of information that she gave Sandwich Guy, that they wouldn't have been able to blow up all of those buildings. I'm not 100% on that, but I think that's the case. It would make more sense to me. So anyway, Elliot realized she's not going to be helped, so he realized that he can't do anything in that building, so he needs to go to the actual building that is going to be blown up, which is very interesting. He's taking a huge risk. It was very, very high stake, high tension seeing him go in there and try to stop it from happening. But what was really interesting is the battle for Mr. Robot, how Mr. Robot kept taking over his body and kept trying to leave. Of course, he wakes up in the cab, and then he gets back. So it's interesting, this internal struggle, and Mr. Elliot even says in his monologuing that this is really confusing. And it does seem to me it's the two, because you have to think this is the same person. So it's the two sides of them are at battle with each other, and they both have really, really, really want something, and they want different things that oppose each other, but they both feel extremely strongly. So Mr. Robot keeps trying to assert control in order to stop Elliot, where Elliot is just as powerfully trying to assert control to stop this from happening. And it does believe, and this goes along with my theory, that Elliot is ultimately gaining more power over himself. It does seem that he is, he is ultimately getting more power over Mr. Robot, because the first, lapse was 20 minutes, and the next lapse was like 5 minutes, and then it eventually goes down where each lap is only a few seconds. So Elliot is gaining more and more and more control, but he's not able to stop Mr. Robot entirely, and so that leads them to a stalemate, where eventually Mr. Robot just keeps punching himself and trying to knock Elliot out and stuff. Although I don't see how wise that would be to if he actually knocked Elliot out unconscious, then the building would blow up with him in it, and he would die. So it doesn't seem like that's a very smart move. And this allowed for some really great comedic moments in this really high tense, high stakes episode, like when the other guy's in the computer room, and Elliot apparently is trying to communicate with Mr. Robot, and he wakes up and apparently Mr. Robot smashed the computer and the other guy, and Elliot just looks at the other guy and he just freaks out and runs away. But what's even more funny was when they were in the hallway and Elliot kept hitting his head and knocking himself out and trying to knock himself out, and this other guy walks by. It's like, "Are you okay?" And Elliot just doesn't say anything, and then all of a sudden starts pounding his head in the wall. And you see it from that guy's perspective without the sort of visual blinks and cues that they're switching, so you just see it from his perspective. It's just some guy walking down the hallway and all of a sudden starts banging his head. I don't know, that was really funny. But that whole hallway scene was amazing, and I love how they kept Rami Malek the whole time playing it, so you could see that it was basically one guy who just and especially the scenes where they weren't using the ticks, you could tell when Mr. Robot was taking over and which one was Mr. Robot, which one was Elliot, because one would run and all of a sudden he'd stop, look at the wall, and slam in, and he'd wake up, get up again, pull himself up and try to run again, but then stop. So that I love that. That was really interesting. Yeah, again, I don't know how realistic this is. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not at all realistic, but it was really interesting. Made for great storytelling. So I'm willing to forgive that part of it. But apparently, and again, this is what I'm saying, is Elliot is getting more power because he actually manages to get to the room eventually, even though he's very bloody and banged up when he gets there. So he hasn't conquered Mr. Robot entirely, but it's obvious that he has the upper hand. Otherwise, if Mr. Robot had the upper hand, then he'd be in a cab going further and further away, and every time he tries to stop and get out of the cab, he would end up going back. But this is working the other way. He's actually getting closer to the goal of stopping the thing from happening. So I think Mr. Robot is realizing this is why this time he actually does try to communicate with him and says, "Look, just give it up or you're going to kill us both," which is an obvious concern for him to have, but I guess he's willing to risk his life rather than not let Stage 2 happen. Like, he wants to risk his life for Stage 2 to happen, I should say. So that's very interesting. But then, of course, Elliot communicates. And I'm not sure when Elliot figured this out. Maybe when he was looking at the computer, but he says, "Check. There's no files. All the paper files on here. You're being played. You're being lied to." And so that's when Mr. Robot realizes, oh shit. Now at first, he doesn't know how to do this or doesn't know what to do, because just because the paper records aren't there, like, why does he have incentive to stop the explosion? I suppose is to save his life, for one, because he's in the building, and the building could explode at any second, which is amazing. In fact, if you consider this episode in linear time, all the other buildings explode before Elliot stops. Because you see Angela and Darlene's phone ringing, going off and stuff, and that was shown to us before. So the building could have gone at any time. Now, I'm watching an interview from one of the writers, and they did specifically say that that building was meant to explode, and had Elliot not stopped it, it would have exploded, went up just like all the others, even though there are no paper records there. I guess Dark Army doesn't really care that much about that. It was more of the thought of the matter. So Elliot did need to do that, and it's going to be really interesting what the dynamic between Elliot and Mr. Robot going forward, now that Mr. Robot knows he's been lied to. Although he was being lied to further the goal that he wanted done, like Stage 2 still went forward, so I don't know if he'll be happy about that, or if he'll just consider himself betrayed and nothing is happening or whatever. So then of course we get the big revelation And I love how they did this, where Elliot, they play this triumphant music, and Elliot comes out all triumphant. I saved the day. I stopped the building from blowing up. But of course, you knew there was something wrong because all the phones keep ringing, and everyone kept looking at, and especially when Elliot's walking down the street and everyone's like crying and they're sobbing, and you're like, what the hell is going on? And Elliot himself is like, do they know something I don't know? And of course, he watches news feed and find out 71 other buildings were destroyed, which is really interesting, and I'll get back to that later. But now let me talk about Angela. So this is really interesting. Like, Angela actually, other than that opening scene, she didn't have that much to do in this episode. She had that confrontation with Elliot, but then she was on the subway, and you see someone with F Society mask pull a gun on her. Now, this was really a edge of your seat, high tension scene, because you know that White Rose said specifically that she was going to kill Angela once she didn't need her anymore, which also brings another sort of nice dynamic to this, because Angela doesn't know this yet. She's like completely drinking White Rose's Kool-Aid. She's completely on board with the White Rose and thinks that she's going to bring her parents back. Doesn't realize that she's actually planning to kill her. So we, the audience, know this, and she doesn't know this. So when we see some guy with the F Society mask trying to mug her and point a gun at her, my thought, of course, and I think this is what they want you to think, is that was an agent of the Dark Army who was ordered to kill Angela, and using the robbing, the mugging as cover, like to make it, for the police or whatever, pretend it was just a random mugging, but really he was sent specifically to execute her, which is what I thought. But then, of course, they kill Angela, and we don't want that. But apparently it turned out just to be a normal mugger, and so he just ran off. And it was interesting when the old ladies, of course, were like, oh, what are you, crazy? You could have been killed. And she said, no one's dying today. So she's deadpan certain that no one's going to die. And of course, we know that she's being lied to, and she doesn't even realize this. Irving assured her, "Oh, we're going to evacuate the building, sure, whatever." But we see that when Elliot arrives, they evacuated the building when he called in the bomb threat, but it had been long enough where they started going back in, and so they had no intention. They had every intention of letting those people die, and of course, which we know because they say in the news report at the end of the episode, of the 71 building that exploded, people were inside and people died. They said the death count was in the thousands. So that is a huge deal. So basically, this is going to become the new landmark of the show in this world, because before it was the 5-9 hack, but now this is basically a new 9/11, or worse, basically. So this is like a huge thing, and I do wonder how Angela's going to react to this, because she was assured that that no one would die. In fact, a hell of a lot more people died than she originally thought was possible. So I wonder, and if this is going to sour her to White Rose, going to reconsider her position, especially because we see this big showdown between Darlene and Angela. Now, earlier when Darlene was with Dom, she could tell that Darlene was holding something back. In fact, she was very pissed. It's like, don't think I don't know you're hiding. And that just shows what a great detective or FBI agent that Dom is. She's able to pick these things up. And so Darlene, of course, I didn't know at first. I was like, what is she hiding? But it's Angela, of course. She's hiding the fact that Angela's involved. And then she goes to Angela and say, why shouldn't I just give you up to the FBI? Because you're screwing with us. And I love how Angela's response was, well, turn me in if you like, because I'm completely on board with this. I think she even said to Darlene, no one's going to die. So it's going to be really interesting to see their reaction, because they're both looking at the things at the same time and seeing that thousands of people just died, basically because of what Angela did. Angela helped kill thousands of people. Now, I talked about in the last episode how, shocked and devastated and just out of it she was by the fact that she basically told Irving to kill that one person who said, "Oh, we'll take care of her." It's obvious that take care meant kill. And she was sort of just trying to hide that and trying not to acknowledge it and just move beyond it. How's she going to feel about killing thousands of people, especially if my theory or my interpretation about earlier about how giving Sandwich Guy that thing is what allowed them to destroy all of those buildings? Then that makes her even more complicit. So how is she going to respond to that? How is she going to respond to people lying to her? It's interesting. One thought I had, though, is if it is in fact time travel is the ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal is to change the past, then maybe she will think none of those deaths matter because they're all going to be brought back to life anyway once the past is changed or whatever. They're still being vague. We still don't know entirely if that is the case, but it is looking that way. So that's another interesting thought to have. So anyway, let's talk more about Dom, because her storyline was really intense. Because she got the tip from Darlene from Elliot that where Tyrell is. And it is interesting that Elliot was willing to work with the FBI to that extent. But he didn't tell them about stage 2 at all, though, which I think is. I was kind of expecting him to. I think that he would. Maybe he just thought they'd get in the way and they wouldn't help or whatever. But I don't know. It seems like that was a bit of a mistake. Maybe that was the Mr. Robot side of him asserting himself too much. Because, like I talked about before, Elliot in the past, even when he's fully Elliot, he says he still misses Mr. Robot. So there's still a side of him, even when he's full on Elliot, that is kind of there, Mr. Robot, whatever. But, so whatever reason, they didn't tell Dom about stage 2, but it told him where to find Tyrell. So it was interesting that he was willing to work with him to that extent. So, of course, she goes to Santiago, who we know is a crooked bastard. He's trying, you can just see, I hate this guy. I think it's funny, even though I knew it was so obvious that he was working with the Dark Army, that he was crooked from the deep into season 2, like it was very obvious, but for some reason I hate him even more now that we know for a fact. And especially you see Dom going to him about Tyrell, and you can see the wheels in his head turning. How do I stop this? How do I stop this from happening? He's trying to make up an excuse. Well, let's just do surveillance. We want to do this right. We want to do this by the book. And as soon as Don walks out of the office, he's like, "Oh my God, I gotta call the Dark Army. Oh my God, we're compromised." Fuck that guy. And they try to humanize him later in the episode by where he calls his mother, and the writer in the interview even said that this was a scene to show that, to try to humanize him, say he's just like a normal person. But to me, that made him even come off of even more of a slimeball. He would kill his mother. He would save his mother, even though I don't know if she'd be in that much danger unless she works at E-Corp, because it seemed like it was only the E-Corp buildings that blew up. But regardless, he was willing to save her, but didn't let everyone else die. Let thousands of people die. So fuck him. Yeah, I'm sorry. That doesn't make me sympathize with him anymore. So anyway, I love the scene when Dom was sitting with her partner, and she's like, "Are you hungry?" And he was like, "Yeah, I could eat." And I was like, "Well, yeah, no, what I'm saying is, do you want to go get some food?" And it's obvious because they were just looking at the Red Real Barrel restaurant. And it's funny seeing the interactions. As soon as she said that, he picked up. I was like, yeah, I love the music they were playing. It was like, I don't know how to describe it other than badass Quentin Tarantino-esque music. And they were just playing up huge badasses, yeah, we're going to lunch. And that was just so great and so amazing. And then, of course, they didn't actually go to eat to lunch. They went there to actually stake out the restaurant, because the guy was her partner was in the van overlooking the place while she was just counting the people. And of course we see the same clerk that was there when Irving was there, and it was interesting. And she's sort of checking out the place. So that was high stake, high tension. Really, yeah, especially the way it was intercut with everything else and the tense music that was playing. Again, it was all done amazingly well. And then she goes down there, and apparently she just missed Tyrell by a few minutes, and but does see him at the end where he's talking about you have to stop the attack, and she says, what attack? And they didn't really follow up on that. This sort of, I guess the attack happened, so realized they were too late. But speaking of Tyrell, let's talk about Tyrell. And this is the interesting thing that was sort of confirmed by the interview I watched or listened to rather, with the writer, who said he was talking about Tyrell, and basically, and I didn't catch this before, but this whole blowing up the 71 buildings was his idea. I did not realize this. Apparently in episode 4, when he's talking to Irving, and Irving's trying to build him up and be like, oh, you're the god now, you can take over. And apparently he said, I need the full force of Dark Army. And I actually didn't think much about that line at the time, but apparently, because if you think about it, in that episode when Tyrell was talking to Angela, Angela was saying, oh, we can have all the paper, shipped to this New York site over the weekend. And then Elliot blocks out for 3 days, so when he wakes up and they're seeing that Dark Army is actually going forward with stage 2, you assume that that's what they did, that they had all the paperwork transferred to the New York building over the weekend, just like Angela said that they could. But apparently that was misdirection, and apparently the paperwork didn't go anywhere, and Tyrell came up with the plan. Apparently Angela didn't know about this. Certainly Mr. Robot and Elliot didn't know about this. So he purposely kept it from Mr. Robot because he knew he couldn't trust Elliot, which actually, from his perspective, was a smart thing to do. Because if he did tell Mr. Robot about it, then Elliot probably would have found out, and he would have made steps to try to stop that from happening. But because Elliot was completely in the dark and thought it was just the one building, he had no idea and was focusing. Like, I think the stuff he was trying to do at the start, and when he was in the main E-Corp building, that might have had the effect of stopping it everywhere. But after Angela did her thing, he was more focusing on that one building, getting people out of that building, going to stop the UPS from that one building from going off, and not realizing that it was going to happen everywhere else. So yeah, apparently that was Tyrell's idea, and that's why when Irving was sort of being very ominous and he's freaking out, the actor who played Tyrell does such an amazing job. Like when having the big eyes, being really freaked out and scared, where Irving's like, yeah, I'm afraid it's a bit more complicated than that. It's such a great intense scene. I really did think Irving was going to kill Tyrell, especially when he reached in his pocket, and I did purposely do this way to make you think he's pulling out a gun, but instead he pulls out an envelope. Now, we still don't know. I'm still unsure of what was in that envelope or what it said. You kind of guess that it had told him that his wife is dead, because he was still expecting to see her and the baby. And they had the handcuff and the bed, and he first handcuffed himself to the bed and set the stuff on fire. So did the instructions, he said to follow the instructions and burn them. Were the instructions for him to kill himself? Were the instructions for him to handcuff himself to the bed, set it on fire so that he died from the smoke? Or was it for him to handcuff himself for the bed and set the thing on fire so the police would come and arrest him? I was kind of thinking, was the instruction for him to do exactly what he did, to go up and say, stop the attacks, and this is all part of their plan? Or, I more got the impression, since at first he handcuffed himself, but then he took it off, and by the time Don got there, the handcuffs were gone, and he was gone, that he was disobeying the instructions, that the instructions told him to handcuff himself, and him going up and saying, stop the attacks, was his own idea. And maybe because if we find out that his wife and child were dead, that everything was meaningless, and I think he came to realize, and we kind of saw this in his acting, sort of when he's sitting there with the handcuffs, that he's sort of contemplating everything and second guessing himself. So maybe he's thinking, thinking maybe this whole thing about me being a god is bullshit. Because basically you have to remember his whole motivation was doing this for his family. He was doing this because his wife was very power hungry. You have to have power in order to be worthy of me, basically. So he was doing it to be worthy of her and doing it to appease her, and then find out that she's dead and her child's been taken away, or their son's been taken away for foster care. That is all completely meaningless, and maybe he completely changed his mind. That's why he ran out. I mean, generally wanted to try to stop the attacks, and that's why he was so like, listen to me, you gotta stop the attacks. Although this is so much speculation on my part. We'll just have to see in the next episode if that does turn out to be the case. So anyway, lastly I want to talk about White Rose. We get a few scenes with her and Price, and I love this banner like that they had, like Price, saying, oh, your resolution came through, congratulations, you got what you want. And they were just chatting and talking about this guy or whatever who they don't like, who invited White Rose for a fishing trip, and they're just like chatting around like old friends and blah blah blah. And then of course White Rose is at the same time plotting to destroy E-Corp. Now at the end of the episode, of course, when they had that fake out, when I thought Elliot stopped the building from blowing up, so you thought that he stopped stage 2, so I was like, ooh, White Rose is going to be pissed. He's going to think, oh no, it's all failed. But he actually had the smug look on his face, which is sort of the first tip off. And of course, we find that what he did actually went for. I mean, that is amazingly dark that he didn't even need to. He had what he wanted with the Congo resolution, but he went after E-Corp anyway. He killed thousands of people just to spite Price. I think any way you look at it, this White Rose character is an unsavory character. It's not likable at all. Not in the right in the slightest bit. Basically evil, I think, is pretty fair to say. Even if she is trying to change the timeline or whatever the speculation theories are, it's just, you think that Angela's wrong for being on White Rose's side. I'll put it that way. So anyway, that's pretty interesting. So, my rating for Kill Process out of 10 is, of course, a 10. The best. As I said, this is the best episode of Mr. Robot. This was an amazing episode from start to finish. It's beautifully crafted. One of the most tense, on the edge of your seat, well put together, well edited, great music, great performances. Did I say great editing? I'll say it again. Great editing is amazing. Yes. Anyway, so that's it for my review of Kill Process. Be sure to check out my channel as I continue to review episodes of Mr. Robot every week. Also, be sure to check out my channel as I do many other videos and other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.